I'm super excited because I don't know how you guys feel about this time of semester, but I feel like I'm up to here in grading. And Travelogues is like the perfect opportunity to take a break from your normal perspectives, take like a mini vacation, experience some travels from other people, what they've been doing. So we're really privileged to have this, I think, at this time of semester. I'm super excited. My name is Andrew. I'm part of the CEC committee here in the Department of Geography. So just want to welcome you all here today and respectfully acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations on which Burnaby is located. So we offer gratitude for that. And I want to introduce our first speaker. We've got 3 speakers lined up for today. Our first speaker is Nadine Schuurman. She's been with the department since 2000. 2000, right? Yeah, so she's been around for a while. You may or may not know her very well, but hopefully today you get to know her a little bit better. And she will become a familiar face to you if she's not already. So welcome, Nadine. Please help yourself to pizza and drinks as we go through, and we'll just sort of have a conversation here. So I'm super excited.
Thanks, Andrew, and really grateful for the opportunity to talk to my colleagues about what I do and how did I get to this area of research. Oh, can somebody admit Nick? Yeah, this is not what I started off doing. In fact, I think we might have coined the term runnability, but it's just a progression. So what I want to do is not tell you a story about how I traveled to exciting places, because I haven't traveled to exciting places, but I want to tell you about how I got to where I am now from where I started. So, as many of you, some of you in this room will know, I started off this sort of intersection between social theory and technical GIS and looking at epistemologies and how they resulted in different ontologies in GIS. And I use the word ontology and GIS in the computer science sense, whereas the universe and discourse or what is enabled by the program. I spent a lot of time in that area, but slowly I transitioned into health research. And really 3 areas of health research. Population health, or what makes some populations healthier than others, is a super geographical question. Who has access to health services, and what are the repercussions of poor access to health service? And environment and health. And what I want to try and show you today is how each of these things, these 3 areas of health research, are very closely tied to what I'm ending up doing right now at this point in time. So one of the things we did is look at how far away people live from health services and try and understand how that spatial access to health services could mitigate or increase vulnerability to bad outcomes, basically bad outcomes, especially from injury, but from all types of disease. If you have breast cancer and you live 4 hours away from where you're having daily treatment, it's like a huge strain on you, your family, etc. So we developed a series of methods. This is a very simplistic way of looking at it. A series of methods to calculate road travel time. And back in 2005, when I started doing this, we were using a raster-based system, which kept crashing our computers, and we eventually ended up using a vector-based system. And at that time, what a lot of people don't know is that most people, just for health purposes, just calculate travel time as the crow flies, which, if you look at the geography of British Columbia, it just doesn't make any sense. It might make sense in the prairies, but even then, roads don't go in every direction. They don't go as the crow flies. So I spent a lot of time in this area of health research looking at clusters of injury, where people are injured, both here in Canada, in rural areas, and in South Africa. And then we started to ask, because it's an axiom in health research, hey, how come the outcomes are better, the functional outcomes, like how well people can walk after a traumatic injury, for example, how come the outcomes are better always? There's this axiom, as I said, in health research. The outcomes are always better for no matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about injury, cancer, any type of chronic disease. The outcomes are better the richer you are. The better educated you are, the richer you are. So work with a grad student to develop a deprivation index called VAN index, which we felt did a better job than traditional deprivation indices to describe deprivation in British Columbia. And we're still using it, and a lot of people do use it. But I also started just in around 2010 to look at the relationship between the local environment where people got injured and injury hotspots. So this was a second study we did. This was like published in 2012, I think. This is a diagram that was done by one of my grad students, Jonathan Cinnamon. And we just went out and we literally counted. We went to injury hotspots and we literally counted pedestrian infractions and motorist infractions. And one of the interesting thing is that in some areas, pedestrians were actually like walking crossways, you know, diagonally across the crosswalk. Like there were both motorist problems and pedestrian problems. But the key here is we started looking very closely at the environment in which injury was taking place. And started to use that approach, we did a couple studies on multiple sclerosis in the environment, but especially with pedestrian injury, and something I kept coming back to, and we found that, for example, long blocks, bus stops, curb parking, crosswalks, etc., these all had an effect on injury, and so it was very much an environmental, there were a lot of environmental correlates with injury, and we spent a lot of time just boots on the ground. These are pictures from Halifax, did 3 different environmental scan trips, back here, and all with the aim of understanding this relationship between environment, injury, the health issue, and socioeconomic status, age. These things all play into injury. And I started to make generalizations of the environment. So this is a generalization we made of the patterns we observed among many pedestrian injury hotspots in Halifax. Well, often there would be no median, no central median, so nowhere you could, like, no central reservation where you could stand when crossing or lanes of traffic. Often there was like some kind of lower medium socioeconomic status housing, and then an attraction across the road, like an ice cream shop or, you know, swimming pool. This is all true, this happened. There was 4-lane highway and an ice cream shop across from a lake. But this is a generalization. There was one place where there was a men's shelter, and they had to cross the 4 lanes of highway to get to the path that led them into downtown. There were these types of patterns that kept occurring. And so then I started with my grad student asking, well, how do other people characterize, oh, my shoes undone. How do other people characterize urban environments? And we started looking at walkability and unpacking this whole idea of walkability. Well, what is it? And it turns out that it's just really some census characteristics that are made into an index, which may or may not have anything to do with walking. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I hired a student. Some of you will remember him, Russell Copley, who's a really good student. Do you remember Russell? Yeah, I hired him for a summer on one of those, you know, Eureka little scholarships where you put in some of your own money, and I just said, look for runnability. Like, is it a thing? Like, because we're talking about walkability, we know running's good for health. Like, is it even a thing? And basically, there was nothing. There are a few papers now, and I said, okay, let's create a runnability index. And so we created what we call the Rough Runnability Index. And it got published. And then I was like, okay, we need to do a survey. And what you start to see here is I'm really out of my depth intellectually. I don't know how to do surveys. One of the problems with my survey, I had no survey training. One of the problems with my survey, and we tried to make it international, we did, my grad student at the time, Leah Rosenkrantz, she put out ads on Instagram and Facebook when anyone's talking anything to do with running, and tried to make it like global. But one of the questions was, you know, what are these things you're afraid of on the trail? And like, number 1 was bears, and number 2 was cougars. And apparently, not everywhere in the world, people care about those things. That's what I'm afraid of. But yeah, so we got over 2,000 respondents. We had about 1,730 that were good. And then we also recruited people to give us their Strava data. Oh, so I didn't put that in there. Okay, well, it's next. So we found a lot of differences among sexes. We found a lot of differences among trail and road runners. We published a paper on the environmental preferences of road runners, and we just got a paper in preparation, almost ready to submit, on environmental preferences of trail runners. And then unanalyzed data, we also just basically got people to give us their Strava data for 2 years. So we collected 2 years of Strava data for over 300 people. And so we have everything they put in Strava, every photo, every narrative, and my student Stella, who's on campus today but actually teaching in a lab, we're going to start analyzing that this summer. And I gave my data. A lot of my grad students are still donating their data because we gave them watches and off doing their life post-graduation, donating their data. Yeah, we did the survey paper, as I said, and then we bought a data set from Strava, which was about 30,000 US, so a lot of money. And so we have a year's worth of Strava data. We just started to analyze that. And yeah, and one of the things I want to do as I go forward is really start to think about the relationship between socioeconomic status and runnability. I think there's a very strong relationship there. Ethnicity and race. I just read this book called Running While Black. I mean, it's one of the things about traveling a long way to work. If you read more, I was telling someone that, and just like was absolutely fascinating, and it really made me think. And so we're going to start to develop some surveys of people around the seawall, whether they're running or not running, and ask them about accessibility and how safe they feel running. And looking at time of day with our Strava data and also environmental features. But the interesting thing here, and the reason that I started with the health research, is that focus on local environments and looking very closely at where people are injured or where they're sick or how long they have to travel for care. It's all in this research. It just, the nexus was when we started to look at environments in terms of walkability, and then from there to runnability, and yeah, it's all in there. All the methods are in there. They're just being used in a different way now. And so that's how I got to where I am now. And yeah, questions? You can ask questions.
I'll open up the Zoom people. There's like 6 or 7 people out on Zoom, so if you guys have questions too, feel free to enter those in the chat box, and we can look in here as well.
I have one. So that was really enjoyable. I liked that. It was, I had seen a version of Stella's research proposal through when she was submitting a grant, so I had some sense of it. One thing that using Strava data is often critiqued for is that it reflects who uses Strava. Could you talk about that? And obviously it's something you're aware of. You know, you were just talking about running while black and so on, but maybe you could expand on that.
A really important question, and really at the crux of whether this research reflects runnability in a sense. I don't think I have all the answers, but yes, it reflects who uses Strava. Mostly white, upper middle class guys, because there's way more men on Strava than women. The highest percentage nationally of people that use Strava is the UK, where 7% of the population is on Strava, which is crazy, but it's much lower here. And I think that if you felt vulnerable for whatever reason, like your gender or ethnicity or whatever, you might not even want to be on Strava because there's tracking problems with Strava. However, it's that old thing with GIS is all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so Strava is what we got, and it is useful. It is useful partly because I don't know, I'm gonna ask Tara. I think a lot of runners use Strava, and we're only looking at running data. We have all pedestrian data, so hiking as well. I don't know how many hikers use Strava. I don't think that many, but I don't know very many runners who don't use Strava. However, it does not reflect the general population, and that's why I think that's why, you know, Stella and I are going to start to talk to people who don't run about, that are in hiking areas or the seawall, like, would you want to run? What are the things that keep you from running? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a key issue to Harvard.
I just want, so on Strava, as you know, there's the option to have the privacy zone, like where you don't,
Yeah, I
it
have
doesn't
my
record
privacy.
like near your house. Are you looking into that, like who is and isn't using that feature? That might give
We don't have that data.
Oh,
Strava
we
doesn't
don't.
give us that data. However, I do have it for the 300 people.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is quite a large sample with that depth of data, and we haven't started to analyze that data. Yeah. I always use it. I don't know if you use it. Yeah. Having been stalked, I'm like, yes, I use it, so, yeah.
I'm not familiar with Strava, so what does it
Oh
do?
my
What
God,
does-
sorry,
what does it
see, I'm not a very good talk to her. Strava is a social media platform for running, cycling, and triathlon. So basically endurance sports, long distance swimming, backcountry skiing as well. Yeah, and so you basically, almost all smartwatches have the option, like as soon as you unpack it and set it up, like you want to send your data to Strava. So it's integrated into almost all, like Garmin, Coros, Suunto, Apple.
So what does it record? Location, distance?
Yeah, so it basically puts a map of where you've gone and also allows you to upload geotag photos. So the photo, where you took the photo will show on the map. You click on the photo and see people, their beautiful photos. And it tracks your stats personally, like how many times have you run this route? Are you faster or slower? I'm usually slower, but that's the way it's going. Yeah. But yeah, thanks. And I will always explain that from now on. Yeah. That's what I got, guys.
Thanks, Nadine. All right. Well, help yourself to a little bit more pizza there if you want, and we'll get Brendan.
Let's go, Maggie.
Very good. So I don't know how many of you know Brendan. He's coming to us from over in EBSC, and we're really excited to have him here today. Was it 2021 you started, or 2020? Okay, so Brendan started in 2020 over in the School of Environmental Science. He came during a time when we were all gone off campus, but he's starting to get recognized. I mean, I've seen him in a number of talks this term already, and we're happy to have him here to get even more connected with him in the Department of Geography. When I talked to him about Travelogues, I tried to introduce it to him as sort of this unique thing, right? Something that's different than just an academic talk. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to tell us today about his experiences working with the biosphere. And I called it, I think in the initial email I sent around, I called it Biodome, which I then realized was, the...
I have a reference to Biodome.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. So this is definitely not a talk that I'm sort of used to giving. This was a time in my career where I was working in science, but I was not publishing in science. So I've never actually done this talk or talked about this work. And it was kind of fun because I actually had to dig back through old hard drives and find photos from like a decade ago to sort of put this together. But just to introduce myself a little bit, Andrew sort of covered most of this, but I consider myself a physical watershed scientist. It's sort of where I fall, but most of my training is as a geomorphologist. And now a lot of my work is in post-wildfire landscape response. So I think about things like debris flow generation. So this is out in Lytton Creek Fire, where I've been working. Things like soil hydrophobicity and impacts on water supply and infrastructure. And I do a sort of range of methods, including sort of fieldwork with environmental monitoring and computational modeling and geospatial analysis. And sort of my experience in the biosphere really sort of influenced my career trajectories and many of the things I'm still doing. But just to sort of put some context on where I came from before I got here, I grew up in Austin, Texas, with two geologists for parents. So this is my brother and I. being handed rock hammers where we just basically got to run around. I don't know if you could get away with that nowadays, but I had my own crack hammer and we ran around just hitting rocks all the time. And if you're not familiar with Texas, I find that there's a lot of perceptions in Canada when I come here. It's not such a terrible place, I promise. This is more sort of what I'm used to. This is the hill country of Central Texas. And I grew up spending my time in places like this. You may not know that there are places that look like this in Texas, but there are wonderful swimming holes and places to explore. These were some old photos from high school and other things, just running around. And the one thing is if you're also not familiar with Texas, we love chili, we love food. But I heard this quote once from a bluegrass singer doing an interview on a radio station. And they said, "Oh, you're from Austin, Texas." And he said, "No, I'm from Austin in Texas." And I think it's probably the most appropriate quote because Austin is often described as the blueberry in a bowl of red, and a bowl of red is what we call chili. So, you know, not to get into politics, but it's not exactly as Texas as you might imagine. And from there, I went on and got a geology degree from William & Mary out on the East Coast in Virginia. And it was a very different place for me. I went and, you know, there's big trees. We actually had autumn. I learned that, you know, trees actually do change color. And it was a beautiful place, but, you know, it was a liberal arts education where I sort of was taught how to think and how to think critically, but not necessarily how to get technical skills. So I graduated and I didn't really know what I was doing with my life. And I really loved my time there, but yeah, I graduated and I jumped in an old Ford Explorer and I drove around the western United States just climbing until I ran out of money. And then sort of dragged myself back home and started applying for jobs and trying to figure out what I was doing. And when I did that, I just got really lucky and almost immediately I found a job posted on the Gilbert Club listserv, just an email listserv for sort of geomorphology. And there was a job posted at Biosphere 2 in Tucson, Arizona. I had never been to Tucson and I had no idea what Biosphere 2 was, but I seemed to meet the qualifications, so I said sure, and applied. And I found myself driving out to this landscape. And I had no idea what I was in for. I got there and I was like, there are no trees. The only thing that sort of resembled trees were the saguaros, and I, even to this day, remember I sat in a bagel shop and I had this moment of like, what am I doing with my life? I was really questioning my decisions at that point, but what compelled me to go out there was when I went out, this was my office. So this is Biosphere 2. It's not actually in Tucson, it's in Oracle, Arizona, which is about an hour drive. And I'll sort of talk through it, but it's effectively a space station sitting out in the middle of the desert in Arizona. And it was built in the 80s, like I think it was 86 to 91. And so this is it. This is sort of an old photo of it, but you can see there's sort of a whole compound. It sits on about 40 acres is the property, but then there's actually a larger sort of 1,600 acres where it sits at the foothills of the Catalina Mountains. It was beautiful. Like most days I would walk into work and I would take pictures, then I would leave and I would take pictures, and so I have tons of like sunset and sunrise photos from this job. But what's going on when we're sort of looking at all of this is there's actually a number of biomes inside, if you're not familiar. And so in this sort of pyramid here, there's a tropical rainforest. It's probably about 25 meters high. And then you transition over and there is I think it's 3/4 million gallon ocean with a living live coral reef that's inside. That then goes to an upper savanna that then transitions into a coastal fog desert. And then over here they've got what they call the technosphere, which really kind of runs underneath. It's all the pipes and electricity. And then you see this that says the habitat and kitchen, which if you're not familiar might seem a bit odd, but I'll explain in a second. And then there were these things that were the lungs. There's the west and south lung. And this is actually a setup that allows the whole system to breathe. And they're like essentially huge intertube, or like inflatable tubes that are inside there that actually can expand and contract to deal with the pressure changes in this huge facility. The whole facility is something like 4 acres, I believe, under glass. So just to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, so this is a view of the rainforest. And so, like I said, it's something like 25 meters tall. They have grown all sorts of plants and trees in here. An interesting thing is they actually found out that you need wind to grow trees. They grew these trees and they're something like 70, 80 feet tall, and then they all started just falling. So if you go in, you'll actually see that all the trees are tied up to the space frame, which is this sort of structure it was built with. And the reason is that they have like no root structure. It's sort of an unexpected outcome. This is the coastal fog desert. It's really supposed to sort of resemble something you might find in like Baja, Mexico. And the reason it's a coastal fog desert is it's getting humidity from that rainforest. They don't have it completely sort of isolated here. And then this is the ocean. You can kind of see the coral reef underneath there. If you're from the outside, you can actually go down and they have a cutout section so you can see in and see all the fish and see the coral reef. But it's big enough that you can take a boat out and you can see there's a little dinghy just for scale. But it's a pretty large facility. And so if you're not familiar with the story here, you might be asking sort of what's all this about. And they actually locked these 8 people in there for 2 years, from 1991 to 1993. And so for that reason, there's actually this other area called the intensive agriculture biome. And inside there was, at one point, was regarded as one of the most productive, I can't remember what the total acreage is, I think it's about an acre, but one of the most productive acres of land in the entire world, because they were growing enough food to sustain themselves as they were locked inside for this period. Now, why would you lock 8 people inside here? It comes down to sort of these 2 gentlemen. So Ed Bass was an oil tycoon from Texas, one of the richest sort of billionaires at the time in the 80s. And he liked to spend his money on various things, one of which was this venture, and which was all being led by this guy, Johnny Dolphin Allen. And John, depending on who you talk to, some people regard him as a cult leader who indoctrinated Ed back in the 70s and got Ed to give him a lot of money to do this. And the idea was really, it started with this company called Space Biosphere Ventures. And so sometimes you hear the narrative change about sort of what the intentions were initially, but really what they were wanting to do was figure out how to sort of take their group, their enlightened group, off planet Earth and be ready to leave. And so the plan was that they were going to lock, this was supposed to be a 100-year experiment, where every 2 years they would rotate in a new group of people, and they would do that 50 times. And they figured within 100 years we'd be ready to go to Mars or wherever we might be going. And they would be the ones ready to do this. And Ed was totally on board with their ideas and thought maybe he could actually monetize this a little bit. And so it actually became a bit of a tourist attraction. And so as these 8 people were locked inside, people would come and like look at them like animals in a zoo while they're sort of doing their work and everything else. And they were scientists, but they weren't sort of traditional academics doing a lot of this work. This guy here was the only one with a higher ed degree, he had a doctorate, the only one with a doctorate, and he was the medical doctor. But he was a medical doctor who specialized in sort of low caloric diets to live forever. And so he was kind of the right person for this because they were all sort of locked inside with limited food. And it was quite the sort of ordeal. They put on these jumpsuits and these spacesuits. They really sort of put it all together. It was like the old footage is pretty funny because it really was kind of overdone. But they did actually stay in there for 2 years and 20 minutes, and it was from 1991 to 1993. And they came out, and it had gone from sort of this, everyone was really excited about it, to everyone sort of viewed it as this failure. And the reason was that people found out that they did 2 things while they were inside. One, they ran out of food, and so, well, that's just not a very impressive sort of outcome. And secondly, that their O2 levels were dropping to the point where they were like losing their minds. And they were fighting, they were bickering. It actually became almost as exciting of a sort of psychology experiment as it was sort of a scientific experiment. And as they did this, they finally reached a point where they could not continue, and so they turned on CO2 scrubbers And then they also started injecting oxygen. And if you watch some of the old footage, they say like they were just like running through the oxygen and they were like giddy and laughing. It would like change their whole attitude. But everyone viewed this as a failure, right? It was supposed to be this self-sustained, closed experiment. Can we lock these people in and have the atmosphere sort of continue? And so if you go and look at this online, these are kind of like, I just searched really quick. It's like 8 Go Mad in Arizona, how a lockdown experiment went wrong. Like the lost history of one of the world's strangest science experiments. What really happened, right? Like there's all this sort of intrigue about what went wrong and like 8 people attempted to live there. And actually this is kind of the interesting outcome is that they did all of this, the O2 levels went down, and it was actually not because of anything they necessarily did wrong in terms of managing their Earth systems. It was all of the concrete was not chemically cured. And so the concrete was actually sequestering a lot of that oxygen, and so that was the reason. It was like the man-made material in this whole structure that sort of caused it to fail. And that has led to it being kind of viewed as a bit of a joke. And in 1996, Biodome came out, and I didn't appreciate this film until I worked there, and then I was like, this is a great film. But they really they did their homework. If you've seen the old footage and then you watch this, you're like, yep, they are replicating this and they are mocking it. And the whole thing sort of went sideways, and eventually the sort of quote-unquote cult was actually dragged off the property by federal marshals. And it was all because of this man. You recognize him? This is Steve Bannon of the Trump administration. And I feel like this picture right here just sums it up. And Ed, as in Ed Bass, made Bannon CEO. So he hired Steve Bannon to come in and basically take care of things, and he did, and he took it over, and he basically submarined the whole thing. So if you ever find yourself wondering, like, why is there no science? Why can't I find any publications about the original experiment? It was this whole grand thing. He basically destroyed all the data, and so it is gone, has been lost, unfortunately. But yeah, so if you're interested in that story a bit more, there's this great documentary called Spaceship Earth on Netflix, and it'll sort of tell more about all of that. But where I fall into this whole sort of storyline is I got hired and I showed up to join the Landscape Evolution Observatory, which was going to be built in the old agricultural biome. And this was going to be this grand experiment, about $10 million to build watersheds inside the biodome that we could basically study climate change on 3 replicate landscapes. But when I showed up, it looked like this. It was just empty. They'd scraped all the soil out. And I was handed just random projects. I had no idea what I was doing. And the first thing I was told was, you need to design the precipitation system for this whole experiment. And I was like, I don't know the first thing about sprinklers. But I was just given parameters. It was like, it needs to do this. And this is literally what I did. I had to put a grid out on the concrete, and I put cups down on every grid corner, and I would rain on that experiment, and I had parameters, like how much variation there could be, and what the magnitudes of rainfall intensity had to be. And I would sit there, and I would take all my cups and like stack them up and weigh them and do this, and try to figure it out. And so that was sort of my first task. My second was, and reminding you I had no technical skills at this point, my boss would walk in and just drop equipment, right? All these sensors on my desk, and he would say, okay, I need you to figure out how these work, how we get data out of them, and how to install them in that landscape for 10 years where they won't fail. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what are these? You know? And I was testing different soils, I was like testing soil properties. I'd not done any of this, I was just sort of figuring it out on the fly. I would often ask him, why did you hire me? And he was like, it was a recession, there was a lot of people who were applying for jobs and you were cheap. And he was like, and I figured you could figure it out. And I guess I did. But yeah, I would have to do things where I created these sort of setups where I would try to figure out how to get these installations to work, because there was a lot of conditions on how they would work, right? So we would take things and they'd want to figure out how can you install this from the bottom instead of the top down so we don't disturb the soil surface. And eventually I would scale it up, and I had this little flume. This was sort of my my little setup, and I would try to figure out how to make everything work and run my own sort of small Biosphere 2 LEO experiments. And so we had through flow coming through, and I was measuring the rainfall intensity and measuring the output of the flow. And I had this thing full of sensors, and I would change the angles and change the soils and try to figure out, at what point could I induce runoff on this surface. And I just got to sit there as a 22-year-old with like no idea what I was doing, basically just figuring out how soil hydrology worked and figuring out how to measure it with sensors. But the great part of this job was that my boss had this sort of mandate to do field work as well, and he would just, I'd never know what we were doing. I would show up and he's like, we're going to Mexico, And I'm not even joking. But we would go all over. So we would go to Mojave, we would go all over Arizona, we would drive to California. I started getting to learn how to do terrestrial LiDAR scanning, and we would scan earth flows along Highway 1 here. And I got dragged out to burned landscapes. I'd never seen a wildfire before. And we were doing terrestrial scanning, looking at debris flows. I got to we'd go to Mexico, and there was this incredible river restoration project going along the border. This is the border fence, and we would just be, it was probably not the wisest thing, but we would just be surveying river channels across the border, because that was what we were trying to figure out, how much this effect had on it. And so we were running, Border Patrol hated us, because we were illegally crossing, but we had passports, and we were always coming from Mexico into the United States, and we had the passport for the country we were in, so we drove them nuts, but it was a wild time and a lot of fun. And I also got to learn how to do all sorts of environmental monitoring. We'd set up, partial flumes, we'd be setting up all sorts of sensors out in the field to measure things, doing surveying. And so it was just this whirlwind sort of year of a job where I was either doing this, driving around the sort of western US and western Mexico, or under the glass. So just to sort of wrap all this up, where did this all land? What's sort of the outcome of all of this? Well, so the Landscape Evolution Observatory, it got built. And so, we figured out how to do all of this. This was installing the epoxy on the floors, and then slowly sort of putting in all of the soil. And so within these soils, there's a grid, and there's this pattern of sensors that come up. And I think there's something like 4,500 sensors in each one of these landscapes that are about the size of a soccer pitch. And they're all sloped, and they look like this now. And my precipitation system is still set up and running, and I found this hilarious that they actually are still measuring how it works using the same slow, tedious process of putting cups out on a grid. But it's a super, if you're not familiar, it's super cool. The whole thing is basically an enormous lysimeter. So they're all sitting on these scales. So they're measuring, water coming in, water coming out, water outflow. It's a very cool setup, and I think there's something like 50 papers that have now come out of it out of the last 10-ish years. They're continuing to do all sorts of cool stuff here. But I left, and I went on and took my skills to a PhD, working on the Big Island of Hawaii for 5 years, and applying sort of some of what I did there, doing soil moisture sensors and rainfall gauges, but also doing stuff like particle tracking and rock mechanics. And now I've sort of taken all of this, and I'm still doing many of these things today. And so, and now I'm getting to be in the position where I get to have students, and I get to hand them a bucket of equipment and say, figure it out, and then we're going to go to the field, and we're going to do it. And so this was a student, Jordan Linton, working with me, where we were setting up similar sort of monitoring stations out at Linden Creek Fire, looking at sort of soil hydrology response, looking at soil moisture. So it's still doing all of these sort of same things that I never would have gotten the experience doing if I hadn't been this sort of crazy job. So I sort of put all this together, and I thought about what are the sort of points of all of this, what's the takeaway? And I would just say, I learned both that it's a good idea to just sort of take a shot at things every once in a while. I got paid absolutely dirt. I learned what it meant to be paycheck to paycheck in this job. I made more money going to become a grad student, which was part of the reason I only stayed for a year. But I loved my job, I had a great time, and I don't know what I would be doing today if I hadn't just picked up and moved to Tucson and took a low-paying job at Biosphere 2, so thanks.
Questions about Biosphere? More than well, there's one from Zoom here that I can ask. So Peter Keller is asking, thanks for having a fabulous talk. Biosphere 2 was fascinating. Can you tell us a bit about Biosphere 3, the Oslo initiative, and is there a Biosphere 4?
I have to admit I know nothing about Biosphere 3 or 4. All I know is that the #1 question I got asked, because tourists came through all the time, was where's Biosphere 1? Or they'd say, I remember Biosphere 1, and I'd say, I sure hope you do, because you live in it. And that was like the intent. They made it Biosphere 2 because they wanted people to ask where's Biosphere 1 so that they could give that answer, that like, you live in it, we're trying to replicate it. But I don't know anything about Biosphere 3. I saw, actually while I was like Googling some photos, something pop up about it, but I had not heard the first thing about it, so I'll have to look into it.
Do they do anything like experimental in the forest or the ocean part, or just the agricultural part?
So you're talking about currently?
Or ever? Like, other than the first time when people were there?
Yeah, so it changed, there's a long story, it changed hands, and so after the experiment failed, it transitioned to Columbia University, and they took it and they did what they called like flow-through experiments, and they pumped the thing full of CO2. And so there are a number of studies from their time there, and what they wanted to do was see like what climate change would do to these systems. And that was actually some of the early work showing how ocean acidification would kill corals with increased CO2. You could actually just do that there. And so they nearly killed their entire coral reef with that experiment. And they've now spent a lot of time trying to recover it. But they did the same thing in the forest, the rainforest. They actually, Columbia took out all the biome for the agriculture, and they put in a bunch of cottonwood trees, and they were doing similar things, trying to look at plant physiology and the response to CO2. And then now the University of Arizona owns the property, and they've been doing, they're open experiments, but they're doing all sorts of plant physiology in the rainforest, and then doing lots of, I don't think there's as much going on in the ocean anymore though. It did get pretty hammered by the Columbia experiments, to be honest, and I don't know that it's ever really fully recovered. So. Yeah.
I'm curious what it was, do you think, in your application, coming from your background, that made them want to hire you?
I asked him this many times, and so I went to William & Mary, which had a really good geology program, and he had a background as a geologist, and so he was like, I trust that they taught you well and you had like a good transcript, and that was about it. But it was, it's 2010, I guess, and he had said, yeah, he had, it was like height of the recession, like no one had jobs, he was like, I had so many people with PhDs applying for this job, which paid like $20,000 a year. And he was like, and I didn't want a PhD coming in and telling me what to do, because I'm trying to run this experiment. And so he was like, you had a bachelor's and you seemed like you could figure it out. So, but I don't think there was too much more to it than that. He hired me within 2 weeks. I think he was just trying to get someone quick. I think I just sort of lucked out. But yeah.
We must have thought that you thought they were thinking skills, right? Because,
yeah, it was either going to work out or it wasn't. I don't know. Yeah. I guess he figured I could think my way through it. So, yeah.
I've got a question too. Like, this is amazing. You got to work on one of the largest scale land system experiments that's really ever been run inside, right? In controlled experiments. So was there anything you could take away from that shows the difference between what we can do outside of natural Earth systems versus inside, and the constraints we face between those two kind of modes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one, it speaks to, one of the things I would say I learned was the scalability of these things. In order, this was the time where like the CZO experiments were getting really big, the critical zone observatories. And so their idea with really starting this LEO was, we want to do this in a controlled experiment, not just do it in this sort of outdoor. But in order to do it in a way that they could sort of make it scientifically sound, they had to make the landscape a true landscape, right? It was, I think it's something like 30 meters wide by 40 or 50 meters long, right? And have a 10% slope and have convergent topography. And then on top of that, they were then trying to figure out how to move forward, and it was like, you also have to have replicates, right? Because if we're going to do this with ecology involved, because right now there are no plants. The plan was for first 10 years to like run the experiments without plants, and then they would start sort of introducing plants. But if they're going to do that, you have to have replicates. And so, it was like, it just kept getting bigger. And so, it is an incredible facility, but I think it also speaks to that when you start trying to take those things and trying to do it indoors, it does take a lot of resources and facilities. But it also gives you this opportunity. I was working with the soils mostly, where I go out and I am constantly frustrated by the heterogeneity of the system, and I'm working in this like really nice clean system. And so I mean, from my perspective, I at least got to learn how the things work without a whole lot of like noise in that signal. And so that was, and I'm sure that sort of holds true as you move over to the plant physiology and the rainforest or anything else, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's a great sort of scientific value, but it also requires a lot of investment. Like just the electricity bill on that place,
How much money?
it's like $2 million a year.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks.
All right. Again, last but not least, we have Eugene McCaan joining us. Pull up his documents.
Is it okay if I do some more drawings then?
Please do get.
Now that the pizza boxes are gonna flip. No.
That should be fine.
You want to, are you?
Yeah, I'm going to sit instead, since it's less formal and also that gets me out of the way of the screen, so probably better. I was thinking earlier today that this is the first time that I've done a solo presentation to this department since my interview 20 years ago. So if this is rubbish, please don't fire me. Another thing I would say before I get started is I'm going to talk about being in Singapore. Is there a way to get rid of that?
Yeah, just something like that. I think if you just click on the screen, just here. That's what that's. This one.
Oh, I didn't move. Oh,
Sure. That disappeared.
The answer might be no.
Just for now. It wasn't up there before.
it wasn't. No.
If you click more, you should be able to hide controls.
It's not a big deal, I suppose.
There's hide floating media controls.
One down.
That one?
Oh.
Yep.
There we go.
Hey, you.
Thanks. What was I saying? Oh, the other thing I was going to say was that obviously I'm going to talk about my time last year in Singapore. Unlike the other two presentations, this is not going to be about research. When I was there, I mainly was writing stuff that I'd already had done. So anyway, it's going to be about the place, but not really about any research. Okay, so in 2019, the Geography Department at the National University of Singapore asked me if I might be interested in being their visiting professor. for a year, which is a program they have. They bring in people periodically to fill that position. So I was interested, and I had a sabbatical on the horizon, so eventually I spent from August 21 until May 22 in Singapore. The country was still under relatively severe COVID restrictions during 8 of those 10 months. And I was alone for the first 7 of those months, and then Chris and Sophie joined me in spring 22. So in this travelogue then, I'm going to talk about Singapore and about my time there, and I'll explain this idea of cities of Singapore in a minute. Oh, where is this one? All right, so in August and September of 21, I began by travelling during COVID. So at that time then, travel was limited. So my plane flights were very empty. So we were assigning rows rather than seats to people, and even then there was plenty of space. And then after flying via Tokyo to Singapore, I was tested at the airport, shuttled onto a bus, and taken to a hotel that, it was just kind of random. Luckily, I ended up in a nice hotel, a Marriott hotel in the city, and I was in that room then for 2 weeks, not allowed to leave the room for those 2 weeks. So that was my view out of the window of my room for those 2 weeks, onto Orchard Road, which is a sort of famous shopping street in the city. That was a very fancy mall out there, just across the road, and then other condo buildings and malls and so on further around. So in that 2 weeks, I think the geography department at NUS were worried that I was going to have some nutritional deficiencies by the end of it. So they sent me this really nice care package when I first got there, and you might be able to see there it's got a lot of fruit and nuts in it, and it also has a phone card. So they were my basics for that 2 weeks, and then every day, 3 times a day, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I would get a knock at the door, and there would be a breakfast, a lunch, or a dinner waiting for me outside the door that I would pick up and eat, and then leave the leftovers out. So it was an interesting experience for a couple of weeks. Luckily, Rachel Bock, who is a PhD student over at UBC, but who is Singaporean and was in Singapore at the time, she's in geography at UBC, came by the hotel one day and brought me some beer from her favourite local brewery. So at least I had something else to be in my diet. After 2 weeks in the hotel on Orchard Road, I was able to move to my apartment on campus, or just across the road on the edge of campus, National University of Singapore accommodation, and in this building on the right hand side here. And I had to spend another week where I wasn't really supposed to go beyond the apartment, or to a little grocery store just below, just in the complex there. And then after that 3rd week, I was able to travel further, and I got to go into campus, take a picture of the logo and all that stuff. So that was me getting to the point of being able to get out and about in Singapore. Let's back up just for a second. So let's do some geography, and those of you who are good at doing maps should avert your eyes at this point, because they were obviously screenshots from Google. So you can see on the world map on the left hand side that the little red dot there is Singapore on the southern end of the Malay Peninsula. You can see a more of a contextual image on the right hand side. Singapore Island is the main island of a group of other small islands, but for all intents and purposes the only one that has anyone on it. Is the main island there in Singapore, and you can see the border in Malaysia further north, and Indonesia to the south. Singapore is about 150 kilometres north of the equator, so about 90 miles north of the equator. and well, I've got another map in a second where I'll show where I was, where the university is in the context of the island. Another piece of geography, comparative geography. This is the sum total of my GIS skills. So this is Singapore. The blue line is Singapore on the map of Greater Vancouver. So you can get a sense of the scale of the place. So that obviously to scale. So it's a pretty compact place. Data. I'm hitting all the high points. Singapore's population is twice the size of Metro Vancouver's on less than 1/3 of the land area. So it's densely populated. It's 8.5 times denser than Metro Vancouver. It's a third more dense than the city of Vancouver. Its economy is 5 times larger than Metro Vancouver's. The economy is more balanced than our regional economy is. It's balanced between manufacturing, the wholesale trade, which is everything from electronics to oil, and also finance, insurance, and real estate. Metro Vancouver, and nobody will be surprised by this, Metro Vancouver's economy is dominated by finance, insurance, and real estate, and the second most dominant category is construction or real estate. So, you know this. Singapore's population has a large Chinese community with Malay and Indian populations, the Indians mostly from the south of India, which becomes relevant in a second, as the other two major populations. This t-shirt that I'm wearing is the student geography t-shirt, student club at NUS. And it refers to what I just said there. So it's geography in English, in Chinese, in Tamil, because the Indian population is from the south, and in Malay. The two universities are similar size, but NUS has twice the number of faculty per student. So this is where the university is on. Is my cursor showing up? No, is it? Just a second. Go. So this is where the university is in the city. The downtown core is over in this area, but as you can see, significant portions of the island are urbanised. The areas that aren't tend to be protected watersheds, or in the south here, they're the port, and we'll get back to that in a second. So this is NUS's campus. I was living just off the picture to the right-hand side here. Geography's over here somewhere, roughly. Then there's a road here with a lot of housing and malls and so on. And then this is a container port, but it's only a small part of Singapore's full port, which is one of the biggest in the world. So this is where I was. And I was specifically in geography, obviously. I did a bit of teaching when I was there, just a couple of classes, smaller classes. So this was a group of graduate students who I taught one semester. And then I also taught some undergrads, but that was online. The grad class was partially online and partially face-to-face. But the other opportunity that I got to engage more directly with students was to go along on field trips that the undergrads organised during the December-January break. So when they organised something, I would traipse along with them. So one trip they organised was to a local nature reserve within the city, and they had a botanist from the National Parks Department come and walk around with us, and it's great. I mean, as someone who's not particularly knowledgeable about this stuff, to walk around a nature reserve with a botanist is really eye-opening. You suddenly realise that all these green things are actually different things and have different names and histories and so on. And the history is often tied to colonialism, with products coming in, being brought in, or being shipped out, and so on. So some of the students got to practice some of their skills that presumably they learned in their physical geography classes, measuring trees and so on. I just took photos. They organised another trip to a place called the Sustainable Singapore Gallery, which is a place on the edge of a place called Marina Bay in Singapore, which when I was first in Singapore in 2002 was open to the ocean and was salt water, has since been closed to the ocean by a barrage, and over the years has been allowed to become fresh water and is now part of the drinking water in the city. And they have this gallery that is mostly focused on the importance of water and how water is used and how it's created actually in Singapore, or at least recycled for use as what Singaporeans call new water, which is recycled water you can drink. So the students were on that, and someone from the gallery told them the story of Singapore and its water and how they planned it and all the rest of it. Singapore is actually quite dependent on water being piped in from Malaysia because it needs more than it has space for, but a lot of the island a decent amount of the island is protected watershed as well. So anyway, hung out with the students, enjoyed my time at NUS, so good students, nice colleagues, a lot of online meetings because of COVID, of course, and small face-to-face meetings with colleagues, depending on restrictions. It could be 1 or 2 people sometimes at most, or 5 at most at other times. But yeah, so really that's all I'm going to really say about the department and about the university. I think it may be it's maybe more interesting to get out into the city for the rest of the talk, so that's what I'm going to try and do. I spent a lot of time, especially in the evenings and the weekends when I wasn't in my apartment sort of working or whatever. I spent time going around exploring the city with my camera. So I go around alone. Don't feel bad for me, I like being alone. I would take pictures. Having the camera gives you something to do and gives other people a way to define you in place, like what you're up to. So what's that weird white guy looking at? Oh, he's taking photographs, so okay, whatever. So that was useful in that way. And then I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to talk about this and show some of the photographs I took and so on, like how am I going to organise the talk? And it got me thinking about Italo Calvino's famous book, Invisible Cities. And the book is a fictional account of Marco Polo's travelogue as he told it to Kublai Khan. It's a series of vivid descriptions of various cities in the Khan's empire. And the twist in the story is that Marco Polo at one point admits that actually every city he's talking about, he's actually just talking about some aspect of his home city, Venice. So this resonated with my feeling that when I was in Singapore, I'd seen lots of different cities or urban worlds, if you like. So this is me and my camera in Singapore's cities. And I've tried to organise around a series of categories that are problematic as any other categories, but we may as well go with them. So the first one is diversity, and I'm going to use partly because these are things that are obvious in the landscape. So it's for photographs of the landscape. It's useful to use images of religious institutions. It's a little bit skewed in the perception here, so I'm going to use the pictures of the religious institutions to again mention the 3 dominant ethnic groups. But actually, in terms of religious diversity, the second most common religious designation among the population is no religion, and the third one is Christianity, because a lot of the Chinese population are Christians. But the top religion in the country, city, I'll go back and forth between those 2 terms because it's a city-state. The first category is Buddhism, and that's represented, for example, in the heart of Chinatown here by the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple. But it's not only spectacularly large temples like the Buddha Tooth that you see this represented in. Just going around the streets, ordinary streets at any time, you see lots of Buddhist shrines of various sizes. This would be a sort of small to middle-sized one. So this is just part of the landscape that you see. This is the Sultan Mosque in a neighbourhood called Kampong Glam, which is the traditional heart of the Malay population in the city. So a Muslim population. I always think of Islamic architecture, especially at night, is very interesting and nice to photograph. I happened to be there one night outside it at the end of Ramadan, and I'm generally not that comfortable taking pictures of people, frankly. You can probably see this from the pictures you'll see in this. But there was so many people around that it was a bit easier to do that in this case. So I took some pictures of people waiting to go into the mosque during that evening at the end of Ramadan. The Indian population is largely, but not entirely, Hindu. So you see a lot of these temples in different places. The one on the right-hand side is in the area called Little India, but there are others in other neighbourhoods as well. This is also in Little India, and this was taken during Deepavali, what we would call Diwali, so the Festival of Lights. The Singaporean government is very careful to fund celebratory light installations and other sorts of celebrations and so on, equally for all the populations. They're very careful about that for reasons related to kind of nation building, I suppose. So that's the first city. Another city is the global city. So global city has a specific definition for urban geographers. So global cities are command and control centres that organise global economic activities, especially in advanced producer services and financial sectors. So Singapore is considered to be one of the top 10 most important global cities in that criteria. It's in a category of 7 global cities, including Hong Kong and Tokyo, that are only seen as being second to New York and London. So it's a major global city. You can see that in the context of sorry. Honestly, I'm more interested in the images than I am in the latecomers. So the city is one of these important financial centres, and you can see that from the landscape with HSBC, Bank of China. All these companies are located in this central area, and it kind of looms over other parts of the city. Sometimes the more traditional areas of the city, these smaller buildings. And it also, of course, creates one of these kind of downtown canyon effects that you get in any big global city like this, with the skyscrapers and the roads kind of hemmed in by them in the centre of the city. Another aspect of its globalness in this context, with the sort of global elite, is around tourism. This hotel here, which is in front of a science centre that's shaped like a lotus flower. This hotel is the Marina Bay Sands Hotel, which is owned by the same company that owns the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. This has a casino in the basement, and the building itself, which is one of the iconic buildings of the city, is the designer of that building, the architect of that building, is also the guy who did the Vancouver Library downtown, Moshe Safdie. All right. Third city, related in some ways, is Singapore as a port. You might remember from its location that Singapore is strategically located between the Indian Ocean and then the Arabian Sea to the kind of west and east mix up to the west, and then on the other side, East Asia, China to the east, right? So it's a very strategic point, which is why the British were interested in going there in the first place. And it's become a major port as a result of that. It's one of the top 5 ports in the world by cargo tonnage. All the others are in China. This picture here is taken a short walk from my apartment, just down at the water, close to where I showed you where NUS was before. So there's plenty of views of what happens at the port. It's a container port. There's a lot of bunkering of oil that goes on there as it's transshipped, as it goes around the world. These towers here, they're building oil rigs there. There's a lot of American engineers who come and work and hang out in this neighbourhood in Singapore as they build these oil rigs. There's some more of the container port there. And then in this image, it's a bit murky, especially in this light. But the point of this image is that the number of ships that are lined up here in the Singapore Strait. So if they're headed that way, they're going to East Asia. If they're heading the other way, they're going back into the Indian Ocean and maybe over to the Persian Gulf too. Okay. Singapore is often well known among urbanists for the way that people live there, and specifically in terms of the housing stock. So most Singaporeans live in housing like this, and these are built by the government, and they're considered, at least by the government, the way they define it, they're considered public housing. But it's not just for poor people, and the way it works is that 84% of Singaporeans who live in these buildings, they are buying them from the Housing Development Board, which is the main government agency that builds housing, and they're sold at subsidised prices to people who are citizens or permanent residents. They're sold at a subsidised price. The way that they're subsidised is that you own the unit, but you don't own the land, right? So it's the same as what you might know as a community land trust that you see here. After you own the unit for 5 years, you're able to sell it on the public market, at least to other Singaporeans and permanent residents, on the private market, so that you can sell them to others. But what you're getting back on that is not any accrual of income on the land. It's only on your unit again. And the government actually encourages people to move out through the course of their lifespan. They don't want elderly people who are just down to 2 people being in a 4-bedroom apartment. They encourage them to move into smaller places to make more room for families. So the government is continually building these, selling them, and then building more, and then sometimes knocking these older ones down. These ones here are older, and building newer ones which tend to be taller. So this is an ongoing process. This is from the roof of my apartment block. This is looking over out of the university housing towards all of this being government housing, like HDB as they call it. So the type of housing I was explaining there. This is from the ground up. So they are built around community centres and so on, or they're built around transit hubs as well. This is a train going, and maybe too blurry here, but there's a train going by there. I took this picture just after I got there near my apartment. This was just after Singaporean National Day, so they all had their flags out. It's not the only type of housing in the city. There are also traditional older style, what are called shop house buildings still existing. These are very expensive to buy, so if people live in these, they probably work in the finance industry in the global city. The city is also very strongly planned, and they're very proud of it. So this is in the building, the headquarters of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is another national agency, and they have this thing called the Singapore City Gallery. And what it does is basically anyone who wants to visit it, and they often bring school groups there and others, and tourists come and visit it and so on. You can see the people there for scale. They come and look at this big model of Singapore, including new parts that are planned to be built, these kind of beige colours here. And then this white stuff here is Lego, so they've allowed kids to build their own ideas of what should be next in the city. But the basic idea is that they're narrating to the public what they are doing to preserve and to advance the city and the country. They're particularly focused on sustainability, on water, on density, and also on this idea of smartness. So we've probably heard of smart cities. But they also talk, as I'll show you in a second, they talk about the smart nation as part of that. So they have a lot of emphasis on water, as I said, and they also talk here of making Singapore a smart nation. This is Rachel, who brought me the beer, PhD, doing her PhD at UBC, and this is Wen who's doing her PhD in geography at NUS. There's also a public city, obviously, of what people do in the public spaces. It's a city that has very diverse types of public spaces, from kids doing skateboarding to various types of infrastructure to allow people to walk around, to older areas, shopping districts and so on. To these areas called void decks in the HDB complexes. So these are open air ground floor areas where people can congregate when their flats are quite small. It's also quite a controlled country in many ways, so they have, I found this quite funny, citizens on patrol, cop. Of course, the public spaces were particularly controlled under COVID, so it was very restrictive where you could go and where you couldn't go. But there's also more of a liminal city in the alleyways behind the main areas that's a little bit more chaotic, and I like to explore those in various ways and see what was happening down these alleys. Tropical nature is also really interesting, so I bumped into this guy as I was walking along, and this one, it's a monitor lizard, and this one, I'm not sure which of us looks more worried in that picture. And then finally, it's well known as a food city. So when I was getting my pre-flight test for COVID done by a doctor down near Joyce Station in Vancouver, after we'd done the test and he'd been asking me where I was going and so on, as I left his office, he stuck his head out the door and he shouted after me, "Don't get fat." What's it to you? But anyway, you know, that reference to that sort of reputation of Singapore. And one of the ways that Singapore is unique is through the use of these hawker centres, which are places with subsidised food in these stalls that are usually owned by families, usually kind of mom and pop things that sell just one type of food. They are subsidised rents, and the food itself is quite cheap. Usually if you buy a meal and a local beer, usually the beer costs more than the meal bit. So in these cases, maybe the beer would be about $7 and the meal would be less than $5. Okay, so that's where I was. I don't think I saw all of the cities of Singapore. There are private cities that I couldn't get into, obviously, especially not during COVID. Malls are very big there, especially because they're air conditioned. There's a whole colonial historical city that I didn't really talk much about. There's also a migrant worker city that was very hard to access, especially during COVID, but is in general terms. So a lot of work and a lot of housekeeping for Singaporeans and a lot of building work is done by migrant workers from parts of South Asia and also the Philippines. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Eugene.
Questions?
Eugene, you mentioned that these were quite controlled, so what type of government is it? Is it a democracy?
It's,
in quotation marks?
I think it is a democracy technically, in the sense that there are more than one political party, but there is a very strong political party that has been in power ever since independence from Malaysia in '63. It's called the People's Action Party, and they have always dominated government and dominated parliament. So it's their vision of Singapore is very strong, and there isn't a lot. There are other parties, so there is some different visions, but there isn't an extremely strong opposition.
a question from Peter Keller here. It says, thanks Eugene. Singapore often is referred to as the smartest smart city in the big data and the Internet of Things AI literature. Did you experience any of what some call the hyper-connectedness of this city?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, I think the thing that was most hyper-connected was the tracking app. so you were tracked everywhere, like for during the COVID period, and then they backed off of it in the last couple of months.
It's like you were on Strava.
Yeah, yeah, it was, yeah, exactly, yeah. So, and then beyond that, they have the electronic road pricing gantries in the centre of the city, so there is that sort of tagging of cars. The number of cars in the country is also quite well planned, and it's very expensive to have a car, and they try to limit, well, they do limit the total number of cars on the island. There's still a lot of cars. It's not like there's car free or anything, but they regulate that quite strongly. But honestly, beyond that, I didn't see anything that would really have made me think, wow, this is a particularly smart city. But data gathering is obviously one very important part of smart cities, and that is happening through those examples.
Well, thanks Eugene. Much
Thanks a lot.
appreciated.
Thanks.
Again, to all of our speakers, I just want to say a big thank you.